There's a moment in every story where pressure stops being the enemy and becomes the catalyst. A moment where exile stops feeling like punishment and starts revealing its purpose. A moment where the question is no longer, why is this happening? But what is this shaping me into? In Jewish tradition, that moment has a name. It's not redemption. It's not salvation. It's not the end of days. It's something quieter, sharper, and far more personal. It's the transition phase. The space between exile and redemption, the threshold where identity is tested, clarified, and ultimately transformed. And according to the logic of the Fifth Exile, this transition is not a miracle. It's not a prophecy fulfilled in a single dramatic moment. It's a shift, internal before external, psychological before geopolitical, identity-based before world-based. To understand the transition phase, you have to understand what actually ends an exile in Jewish thought. Because exile doesn't end when the world changes. It ends when Israel changes. Not geographically, not politically, but existentially. The Fifth Exile is defined by pressure, not displacement, by legitimacy battles, not land loss, by narrative warfare, not armies, by global judgment, not global invasion. So, the transition phase begins when Israel stops reacting to the world's pressure and starts defining itself from within. This is the first truth of the transition phase. Exile ends when identities, not when enemies fall, not when nations approve, not when the world apologizes, but when Israel no longer needs external validation to exist. In every previous exile, the turning point wasn't geopolitical. It was psychological. A moment where the people realized that survival wasn't the goal, purpose was. The transition phase is that moment for the Fifth Exile. It's the shift from fragility to clarity, from reaction to conviction, from being shaped by pressure to being refined by it. Jewish tradition describes redemption not as a sudden event, but as a maturation, a world that grows into peace rather than collapses into it. A people who rediscover their covenant rather than wait for rescue. This is the second truth of the transition phase. Pressure becomes clarity. The Fifth Exile is defined by confusion, moral, political, spiritual. The transition phase is defined by the end of that confusion. Not because the world becomes kinder, but because Israel becomes clearer. Clarity is the beginning of redemption. Not miracles, not signs, not cosmic events. Clarity. Clarity about identity. Clarity about purpose. Clarity about covenant. Clarity about sovereignty. This is why Jewish tradition refuses to give a cinematic ending, because the real ending is not a moment. It's a transformation. The transition phase is the bridge between the pressure of exile and the peace of redemption. It is this psychological turning point where the people stop seeing themselves through the world's eyes and start seeing themselves through their own. And that leads to the third truth of the transition phase. Redemption begins before it is visible. The world doesn't owns it. Nations don't recognize it. History doesn't mark it with a date. It begins quietly, internally, in the shift from fear to purpose, from reaction to identity, from exile to clarity. The transition phase is the moment where Israel stops asking, what does the world want from us? And starts asking, what were we created for? That question is the threshold, the doorway, the hinge of history, because once identity stabilizes, exile collapses. Once clarity returns, pressure loses its power. Once purpose is reclaimed, redemption becomes inevitable. Not because the world changes, but because Israel does. This is the transition phase. The moment between exile and redemption. The moment where pressure becomes purpose. The moment where identity becomes destiny. And the moment where the Fifth Exile begins to end.